I was 32 when a DNA test blew up my life. My parents were siblings, and everyone knew but me. They raised me on lies, medical silence, and fake smiles. Today I decide whether blood means loyalty or betrayal, and what I do next terrifies them more than they ever imagined. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm going to start exactly where everything cracked because that's how it felt in my body, like a clean snap instead of a slow bend. I was standing in a pharmacy in Des Moines holding a little white box with my name printed on it when my phone buzzed with the results notification. Nothing cinematic, fluorescent lights, a kid crying in aisle 3, a coupon machine screaming for attention. And then the words on my screen rearranged my entire life in one silent second. Close familial match. Detected, which is a phrase so calm it should be illegal because calm language is how people hide bombs. I didn't scream, I didn't drop the phone, I didn't faint, I just felt this cold slide down my spine like my body knew before my brain caught up. I'm Caleb, I'm 32, and I had taken a DNA test because my doctor said my blood work was unusual in a way that didn't fit the story I'd been told. Because I grew up sick in ways nobody could explain, seizures as a kid that everyone called stress, heart murmurs that were probably nothing, migraines that knocked me flat for days, and every time I asked questions my parents, Diane and Mark, smiled too fast and said families just have quirks, and I believed them because that's what kids do when the people who feed them say trust us. But that screen didn't say quirks. It said my parents were first-degree relatives, siblings, and the test didn't ask how I felt about it. It just stated a fact and waited, and here's the consequence. Before context part, because that's the truth of it, my whole childhood suddenly made sense in the ugliest way possible. The secrecy, the way extended family avoided photos, the way medical history forms were always lost, the way my aunt would hug me like she was apologizing without saying why, the way holidays felt staged like everyone was acting from a script I never got. I walked out of that pharmacy without buying anything and sat in my car with the engine off because driving felt dangerous when your reality is melting. And the first thought that hit me wasn't anger, it was fear, because if they lied about this, what else did they lie about? My health, my future, the choices I was allowed to make. And if you're listening right now and thinking you'd confront them immediately, hold that thought, because shock doesn't make heroes. It makes statues, frozen and breathing. I went home and opened my laptop and reread the results like repetition would turn them into a typo. It didn't. So I did what I always do when something feels off. I started tracing patterns, dates, micro-stories that never quite lined up, like the time my mom snapped at a nurse for asking too many questions during my childhood EEG, or the way my dad once joked at Thanksgiving that our family tree is more like a wreath. Everyone laughed too hard, and I laughed too, because laughter is the social duct tape of lies. I pulled out old photo albums and noticed how often they cropped people out, how few childhood photos included grandparents, how my birth certificate had an amended stamp I'd never noticed because who studies their own origin story unless something feels wrong? And then came the realization that landed like a weight. They didn't just hide this from me. They organized the entire family around hiding it, which means betrayal isn't one action, it's a system. It's a long-term project with meetings and decisions and moral compromises that get easier the longer you repeat them. And here's where I talk directly to you because I know someone listening has felt this exact thing without the DNA test. That moment when you realize your family isn't a safety net, it's a stage, and you were never given the script. You were just expected to perform gratitude. I called my sister, Leah, half-sister technically by the story I was told, and asked a neutral question because I wasn't ready to light the match yet. Do you remember anything weird about our medical stuff growing up? And there was a pause long enough to hear the life forming. She said, "Why are you digging now?" No, not what do you mean, but why now? Which told me everything I needed to know. I hung up and sat on my kitchen floor because tears felt too upright for grief. And I thought about consent, not in a legal way, in a human way. I never consented to being born into this risk, to being denied medical truth, to carrying consequences for choices I didn't make. And the rage came after the fear, slow and focused, like a blade instead of a fire, because rage bait works best when it's earned. So tell me in the comments when you hear this. Did my parents cross a line or did they sprint past it? And be honest, because family loyalty is the most abused concept on earth. And right here in the middle, I want to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Because if this is hitting you at 2 a.m. in silence, you're not alone. And if it's midday and you're nodding at work pretending, Everything's fine, I see you. After that, I didn't confront them. I documented, I requested full medical records, I pulled court filings, adoption rumors, church registries. I found a sealed record from the 70s that used the word guardianship where parents should have been. I found a letter from a genetic counselor dated before I was born that recommended non-disclosure to child due to psychosocial risk, which is professional language for we know this is wrong, but we're afraid of the mess. And here's the hypocrisy that should make your jaw clench. My parents built their entire identity around being moral, church on Sundays, lectures about honesty, grounding me for lying about a bad grade, while sitting on a truth that could have saved me years of medical confusion. This is where the realization locks in. Betrayal disguised as love is still betrayal, and the consequence isn't just emotional. It's biological, it's appointments missed, tests delayed, risks unmanaged, and the thing nobody tells you is that when the truth finally arrives, it doesn't feel like freedom right away. It feels like vertigo because lies are load-bearing. Remove them and everything wobbles. I rehearsed conversations in my head, sharp ones, soft ones, cinematic ones, but I didn't have them yet because timing matters. Anger without leverage is just noise, and leverage doesn't mean blackmail. It means clarity, proof, and witnesses. I started therapy, not because I was broken, but because I refused to be gaslit when the next phase began, and the next phase was inevitable, the reckoning, but not yet. First, I needed to decide who I was without their story glued to my spine. And here's the hook that should keep you with me, because the moment I finally confronted them wasn't the worst part. The worst part was discovering who helped them keep the secret and why, and what it cost them when the truth stopped being mine alone. Because when a family builds a wall around a lie, the collapse doesn't just bury the architects, it exposes everyone who handed them bricks. And in a second, I'm going to tell you how one sentence from my mother confirmed everything I feared and gave me the cleanest moral line of my life, the kind you don't step back from once you see it. I waited 3 days before I said anything to them, and those 3 days felt longer than my entire childhood because once you know a truth like that, your brain starts replaying every memory like it's evidence in a trial you didn't know you were part of. I went back to Des Moines where I grew up because distance makes liars comfortable and I wanted discomfort. I pulled into the driveway of the house that always smelled like lemon cleaner and denial, and I sat in my car watching the porch light flicker like it always had. Same house, same paint, same illusion, and the thing that kept looping in my head wasn't rage, yet it was this thought that wouldn't leave me alone. How many times did they look at me and choose silence? Because betrayal isn't one decision, it's a series of renewals. I walked in, and my mother Diane hugged me too tight, and my father Mark avoided my eyes like he always did when something mattered, and I didn't accuse them. I didn't shout. I asked a question so simple it felt almost polite. Is there anything about my medical history you never told me? And here's the moment that still gives me chills, because if you've lived with liars, you learn to spot the half second where they decide which version of reality they're about to serve. My mother smiled and said, "Why would there be?" And that was it. That was the confirmation, not denial, but dismissal, the kind that assumes authority over your own body. And something in me went quiet, the way an engine does, right? Before it fails, I pulled out my phone and placed it face down on the table because I wanted them to hear this without screens or excuses. The DNA test says your siblings. I said it calmly, because calm is terrifying when someone expects tears. My father's fork froze midair, and my mother laughed. Actually laughed, a brutal sound that didn't belong in a kitchen. Those tests aren't accurate, she said, which is lie number one everyone uses because technology feels abstract enough to blame. I slid the phone across the table and watched her hand shake as she read. And here's where the realization deepened into something uglier, because they didn't confess. They negotiated. They said words like context and complicated and different times. They talked about love as if it were a legal defense. My father finally spoke and said, "We protected you." And I want you listening to tell me in the comments if you've ever heard that word used to excuse harm, because protection without consent is control. They told me the story they'd rehearsed for decades. 2 teenagers, isolated town, religious pressure, a pregnancy that would have destroyed reputations. So they married, moved, erased records, convinced doctors to look the other way, enlisted family silence like it was a group project. And the whole time I sat there thinking about my seizures and the nights I slept on hospital chairs while my mother told nurses I was dramatic. And here's the rage bait part that's deserved, they said. They didn't tell me because they didn't want me to hate them, which is the most selfish sentence a parent can say because it centers their comfort over your autonomy. I asked them if they ever considered what it would do to me medically, and my father said, "We prayed," which told me exactly how seriously they took my body, prayer instead of information, faith instead of facts, and then came the gaslighting like clockwork. My mother said, "You've always been sensitive," which is code for inconvenient. And I realized this wasn't just a secret, it was a pattern: minimize, deflect, spiritualize, repeat. I stood up and my hands were steady, which surprised me because steadiness felt like a betrayal of the chaos inside. I told them I needed space, and my mother reached for my arm and said, "Don't do this," as if this were something I was choosing. And here's the consequence before context again. I walked out knowing I couldn't unknow this, and that meant the relationship I thought I had never existed, only a version designed to keep me compliant. The next phase hit fast: extended family, because secrets that big have echo chambers. My aunt called me and cried about how hard it was for everyone and didn't ask how it was for me. My uncle left a voicemail that said blood is blood, which is hilarious when blood is the problem, and Leah, my sister, texted, "They were going to tell you someday," which is the most fictional timeline adults invent to soothe guilt. Someday is the calendar of cowards. I started asking questions publicly, not blasting them online, but asking in rooms where silence had protected them: church elders, doctors who'd signed off, relatives who'd suspected. And suddenly the truth moved from private shame to public discomfort, which is where accountability starts. And let me tell you something that nobody warns you about. When you drag a family secret into the light, the first thing it does is look for a new victim, someone to blame, so the original liars can feel less alone. My parents tried to make me that victim by saying my reaction was tearing the family apart. Classic reversal. The person harmed becomes the harm. And I didn't take the bait. I documented everything: timelines, emails, admissions. I met with a genetic counselor who explained risks I should have been monitored for since childhood. And I felt grief in a new way. Not for what I lost, but for what was never offered: informed choice. And here's where the audience usually asks, what would you have done differently if you were them? And I want you to think about that, because mistakes happen, but cover-ups are decisions. They had decades to tell me gently, to prepare me, to give me doctors and support. Instead, they gave me silence and sermons. The reckoning wasn't loud yet, it was procedural. I changed my emergency contacts. I updated my medical file. I requested corrected records. And each administrative step felt like reclaiming an inch of my body from their mythology. My parents panicked because control slipping looks like betrayal to people who confuse authority with love. They begged me not to tell anyone else, and I asked why. And my mother said, "People will judge us." And that was the sentence that broke whatever was left, because judgment wasn't new, it was overdue. I told them I wouldn't protect a lie that endangered me, and they accused me of cruelty. And here's the hypocrisy that should make your blood boil. The same people who grounded me for lying about a report card asked me to lie about my existence. I left town again, and on the drive back, I laughed once out loud, because sometimes your body releases pressure in weird ways. Not joy laughter, but disbelief. Like, wow, this is really my life. And that laughter turned into clarity. I wasn't seeking revenge, yet I was seeking truth with consequences, because consequences are how reality proves it's real. And the next escalation came from a place I didn't expect: a letter from the hospital's legal department requesting a meeting because someone had flagged my case. And when I read the name of who flagged it, my stomach dropped, because it meant someone on the inside had finally decided silence wasn't worth it anymore. And that decision was about to shift everything, not just for my parents, but for the institutions that helped them hide. So stay with me, because the next turn isn't about confrontation, it's about exposure. And once systems get involved, the lie stops being a family issue and starts being a public one. And that's when people reveal who they really are. The meeting with the hospital didn't happen in a dramatic boardroom like movies pretend it does. It happened in a beige conference room that smelled like copier toner and burnt coffee. And that alone told me this wasn't about emotion anymore, this was about liability. The woman across from me slid a folder forward and said my name like she was tasting it for the first time, and asked me to confirm my date of birth. And I remember thinking how wild it was that the same institution that monitored my vitals for years never bothered to question the origin of my DNA. She didn't start with apologies, she started with procedures, because systems don't feel guilt, they feel risk. She explained that an internal audit flagged inconsistencies between my medical records and a newly updated genetic registry. And I almost laughed, because the word inconsistencies was doing Olympic-level gymnastics to avoid the word truth. They asked me when I found out, and I told them, and they exchanged a look that said, this had been a ticking clock. And then came the sentence that shifted everything from personal betrayal to institutional rot. There may have been falsification of records, which is a sterile way of saying adults signed papers knowing they were lies. And in that moment, my anger evolved from fire to ice because ice preserves. I gave them names, dates, churches, doctors, relatives, and I watched the pen move faster the longer I spoke. This wasn't gossip anymore, this was testimony. And here's the thing people don't talk about when secrets like this unravel. You don't just relive the pain, you relive your entire life with subtitles. Every unexplained symptom becomes suspicious, every dismissal becomes strategic. I remembered a pediatrician once telling my mother I should be screened for genetic anomalies, and my mother switching doctors the next month. I remembered the pastor counseling my parents about honesty while they nodded like saints. I remembered my sister Leah getting attention for minor illnesses while my migraines were treated like theatrics. And suddenly the past wasn't foggy, it was sharp. The hospital asked if I wanted to pursue corrective action, and I asked what that meant, and they said investigations and disclosures and potential criminal review, and my heart didn't race, it steadied, because clarity does that. I left that building knowing a chain reaction had started, and chains don't care who they hit. The next calls came fast, a social worker wanting to discuss mandated reporting, a genetic counselor scheduling a full panel, a lawyer friend asking if I'd considered civil action, and all of it felt surreal, like my life had been quietly rerouted without my consent. My parents called daily at first, then hourly, then not at all when I stopped answering. My voicemail filled with versions of the same plea. We did our best, which is the laziest apology because it demands credit without accountability. Leah sent messages that oscillated between concern and loyalty whiplash. I'm here for you, but they're still our parents. As if biology were a coupon code that erased harm. I want to pause here and ask you something directly, because this is where people split. If your parents hid something that could have harmed you medically, do you think love excuses that, or does it make it worse? Tell me honestly, and also tell me where you're watching from right now, because I read those comments and I know how global this pain is. Back to the story, the audit. Findings leaked faster than I expected, not to the public, but to the family network, and suddenly relatives who'd been silent found voices. Some apologetic, some defensive, some furious at me for not keeping the secret they never asked me permission to carry. My aunt accused me of airing dirty laundry, and I asked her when laundry becomes evidence. My uncle warned me about destroying reputations, and I asked him why mine was collateral. And here's the hypocrisy that deserves spotlight, the same people who preached family unity weaponized it to keep me quiet. I didn't blast anything online, I let processes work, because processes expose patterns. The hospital formally acknowledged record manipulation and referred the case to state oversight, and that's when my parents stopped calling and started lawyering. Silence replaced pleading because fear replaced confidence. I received a letter advising me not to discuss the matter publicly, and I laughed because they'd spent decades discussing me privately. The genetic testing came back confirming elevated risks that should have been monitored and treated early, and the counselor's voice softened when she said, "I'm sorry no one told you." And that sentence hurt more than the diagnosis because it acknowledged a theft of choice. The reckoning inside me wasn't explosive, it was methodical. I wrote down boundaries like rules to a game I'd never agreed to play. No contact until full disclosure, no mediation without accountability, no forgiveness without repair. And when I sent that list, my mother replied with scripture and my father replied with silence. And I understood then that silence was his native language. The state inquiry interviewed my parents separately, and the details filtered back in fragments, contradictions piling up like receipts. Timelines shifting, stories diverging, and lies unraveling because lies require maintenance, and maintenance gets sloppy under pressure. Leah called crying, saying she felt betrayed too, and I believed her because secrets corrode everyone they touch. But when she asked me to slow down for the family's sake, I told her the family had decades to slow down for mine. The first public consequence landed quietly. My father was removed from a volunteer board pending investigation, and my mother stopped attending church when whispers outpaced prayers. And I didn't feel joy, I felt gravity. Because consequences aren't fireworks, they're weights. The hospital offered a settlement for record correction and monitoring costs, and I declined the quick fix because quick fixes are how cover-ups survive. I wanted transparency and prevention so this didn't happen to someone else's kid. And that's when the narrative tried to flip again. Acquaintances asked why I couldn't just move on, why I needed to dig. And I realized people say that when digging threatens their sense of safety, if this could happen in my family, it could happen in theirs, so they call the truth excessive to keep their World intact, the reckoning deepened when an investigative reporter reached out after a tip and asked for comment, and I asked what they already knew, and their list mirrored mine, which meant this wasn't contained anymore. I didn't give an interview, I gave documents. Because facts speak louder than pain when pain is dismissed. The story didn't run immediately because editors verify, and that waiting period tested me. Every day felt like standing on a cliff watching clouds move while the ground eroded. My parents sent a final message asking to meet privately, and I agreed to a public place because privacy had been their weapon. We sat across from each other, and my mother cried real tears, this time not performative, and said she was afraid I'd hate her, and I told her hatred requires intimacy, and I felt distance. My father finally spoke and said he thought keeping the secret kept me normal, and I asked him what normal costs when it's built on lies. He had no answer. The reporter's piece published a week later, and it didn't use my name in the headline, it used the system. Falsified records, collusion, community silence. And that mattered because it reframed the story from scandal to accountability. Comments poured in from strangers who saw themselves in it, and from defenders who called me ungrateful, and both confirmed the same truth. People project when confronted. My parents issued a statement that said they regretted the pain caused without acknowledging the choice that caused it. Classic non-apology. The legal process moved forward slowly like all real justice does, and I learned patience not as virtue but as strategy, and through it all my internal reckoning settled into something solid. I wasn't broken, I was informed, and information is power when wielded with purpose. The last call I took from my mother ended with her asking if we could start over, and I told her starting over requires ending something first, and she wasn't ready for that. I hung up gently because gentleness can coexist with firmness. And as the investigations expanded to include others who'd signed off, the scope widened beyond my family, and that's when I realized the story was bigger than me. It was about how easily authority disguises itself as love, and how often children pay the price. And what came next would test whether the truth I uncovered could actually change anything, or whether it would be absorbed and forgotten, because exposure is only the beginning, and the real question is what you do with the light once it's on. And that answer was about to arrive in a way I didn't expect at all. The subpoena arrived folded inside a plain envelope that didn't look powerful enough to carry the weight it held. And I remember standing in my kitchen rereading my own name printed in a font that felt colder than any insult my family had ever thrown at me. Because this wasn't family anymore, this was the state stepping into a room that had been locked for decades. The document didn't ask for my feelings, it asked for facts, dates, witnesses, communications. And I realized something important right there. Secrets survive on emotion, but they die on timelines. The more precise the questions became, the weaker the lies looked. I sat at my table and began assembling my life like evidence, because apparently that's what it had always been. A trail waiting for someone to follow it properly. I thought about how many times I'd been told I was dramatic, sensitive, imagining things, and how efficient that gaslighting had been because it trained me to doubt my instincts right up until the moment they were confirmed by law enforcement letterhead. And before I go further, I need to pause and ask you something, because this matters for how you hear the rest of this. If your entire identity turned out to be curated by people who claim to love you, would you confront it head on? Or would you protect the illusion to protect yourself? Tell me honestly, and also tell me where you're watching from right now, because this story has reached people from places I never imagined, and I want to know how far. This kind of betrayal travels back to the unraveling. The first interview with investigators didn't feel hostile, it felt surgical. They weren't angry, they were curious, and curiosity is more dangerous than rage when you're lying. They asked about family gatherings, who sat next to whom, who avoided eye contact, who spoke for whom, and I found myself narrating memories I'd never trusted before, moments that felt off but never had a name, like how my parents never showed affection publicly yet were inseparable behind closed doors, how relatives joked about them being too close then laughed it off, how family trees were always vague branches cut short with stories about tragedy and distance. I told them about the documents I'd found in my grandmother's attic years ago, birth certificates, with inconsistencies, adoption papers that didn't match timelines, and the way my mother had snatched them out of my hands with a smile that never reached her eyes. The investigators nodded, because patterns are universal and denial follows the same choreography everywhere. What surprised me most wasn't the questions, it was my own calm answering them. Trauma doesn't always show up as shaking, sometimes it shows up as clarity. After the interview, I walked outside and noticed the sky looked offensively normal, as if the universe hadn't just acknowledged the collapse of my origin story. My phone buzzed with messages from extended family who'd caught wind of the investigation, and suddenly everyone wanted to rewrite history in real time. Cousins who barely knew me swore they'd suspected something all along. Uncles warned me about tearing the family apart, a phrase that always lands on the person holding the truth, not on the people who built the lie. My parents' lawyer sent a letter framing me as unstable, citing stress, anxiety, and public pressure, as if my reaction was the crime, not their action. And that's when I understood something crucial about betrayal by parents. It's not just the initial harm, it's the coordinated attempt to discredit you when you name it. The narrative pivoted from secrecy to damage control, and the speed of that pivot told me they'd rehearsed it long before I ever knew the truth. Leah called me late one night, her voice shaking, saying investigators had spoken to her too, and she didn't know what to say, because she felt like answering honestly would destroy everything she'd been taught to believe. I told her something I wish someone had told me earlier. That truth doesn't destroy families, lies do. Truth just exposes the damage. She cried and said she felt like the floor was gone beneath her feet, and I said that's because it was never solid to begin with. The next wave hit when records from the county clerk surfaced, showing amendments filed years after the fact, signatures, corrected dates, changed explanations, added retroactively, and anyone who's ever dealt with bureaucracy knows how hard it is to change a document once it's filed, unless someone powerful. Once it changed, I started to see my childhood through that lens. Power, not protection, had shaped everything. The favoritism, the silence, the insistence on unity at all costs. My parents weren't just hiding a secret, they were managing risk. And I had been the variable they controlled by withholding information. The rage came later, delayed like an aftershock, when I realized how many choices had been taken from me without my consent. Medical, reproductive, relational choices, all stolen in the name of preserving their image. I thought about the relationships I'd avoided because something always felt wrong about my family story, and how many nights I'd blamed myself for not fitting into a mold that was built to exclude reality. The reckoning became public when the Oversight Committee announced a formal inquiry into record tampering and ethical violations, and suddenly the story wasn't just mine, it was a case study. Reporters started calling not for quotes, but for context, because this wasn't a one-off. It was a system that enabled concealment through silence and authority. My parents' community closed ranks, some defended them as good people who made a mistake, others quietly distanced themselves, proving loyalty is often transactional. And in the middle of it all, I had to decide who I was without the lie. Not in theory, but in practice. I changed my emergency contacts, reviewed my medical plans, rewrote my personal history. In my own words, because reclaiming narrative is a form of survival. There were moments I wanted to disappear, to let the process grind on without me, but then I'd receive a message from a stranger saying this gave them the courage to ask questions in their own family, and I understood that visibility has a cost, but silence has a higher one. The investigators returned with follow-up questions, sharper this time, names, places, dates aligning like dominoes, and I watched the story move from possibility to probability to inevitability. My parents requested mediation again, framing it as reconciliation, but reconciliation without truth is just another cover story, and I declined politely, because boundaries don't need explanations. The legal term they used for what my parents did was concealment and misrepresentation, but the human term was theft, theft of agency, theft of trust, theft of time. The first official finding confirmed deliberate omission of material facts, and my stomach dropped, not because I doubted it, but because validation makes grief heavier, not lighter. When the announcement went out, my parents' last defenders fell silent, because facts don't argue, they conclude, and yet the hardest part wasn't watching their reputations crumble, it was mourning the parents. I thought I had the ones who taught me to look both ways and say please and tell the truth while modeling the opposite in the most profound way possible. I began therapy not to fix myself, but to learn how to live with a reality that had been denied to me. And my therapist said something that stuck, that betrayal by caregivers fractures your sense of time, because your past keeps changing as you learn more. That's why this feels endless, because every new detail rewrites memory. And then came the call that shifted everything again. A relative I barely knew asked to meet, said they'd kept a secret for years because they were told it was for my own good, and when we sat down they slid across the table a letter written decades ago, admitting the relationship, acknowledging the pregnancy, and begging the family to handle it quietly. The ink had faded, but the intent hadn't. I thanked them for telling me now, and they said they were sorry it took so long, and I realized apology timing matters, but truth timing matters more. This letter became the keystone evidence that tied intent to action and erased any remaining doubt. The state expanded the inquiry and recommended charges related to falsification and obstruction. And suddenly my parents weren't just disgraced, they were exposed. The community reacted the way communities do, some with outrage, some with denial, some with silence that speaks louder than words. And through all of it, I kept asking myself what justice looked like for me, because punishment doesn't automatically heal. Justice for me looked like informed consent, going forward, the right to decide who has access to me and my story. It looked like preventing this from happening to someone else by insisting on transparency, and it looked like allowing myself to feel anger without becoming it. The final meeting with investigators ended with them thanking me for my cooperation, a phrase that felt absurd because cooperation implies choice, and I hadn't chosen any of this, but I nodded because I understood that my participation mattered beyond my pain. As I left the building, I felt that same strange calm, again the kind that comes when chaos finally has direction, and as much as I wanted to believe this was the end, I knew better, because exposure always invites backlash, and the next move from my parents wouldn't be legal, it would be personal. They'd lost control of the narrative, and people who lose control don't always accept it quietly. Something was coming, something meant to reassert power, to reframe the story, to test my resolve. And the question wasn't whether they'd try, it was whether I'd be ready when they did. Because the truth may have been out, but the reckoning was far from over, and what happened next would force me to choose between closure and confrontation in a way I never expected. The retaliation didn't arrive as a scream or a lawsuit, it arrived as an invitation, which is always how the most dangerous moves begin, because invitations imply choice and civility and normalcy, and my parents needed all three to reassert control. The envelope was cream-colored, embossed, tasteful, the kind of stationery meant to signal stability and respectability, and inside was a request for a private meeting, framed as healing, framed as closure, framed as concern for my well-being, which made my stomach drop because I recognized the language instantly. It was the same tone they'd used my entire life. Whenever something needed to be buried, I didn't respond right away because timing matters, and so does leverage, and I'd learned that from watching them. Instead, I sat with the discomfort and replayed every time they called a confrontation a misunderstanding, and every time they called silence peace, and every time they positioned themselves as victims of my curiosity. The investigators had warned me this phase often follows exposure, a soft approach meant to extract a reaction, a statement, a mistake, something that could be repackaged later. Still, I agreed to meet, because avoiding them would let them claim I was unreasonable, and I was done letting them define anything about me. We chose a public place, neutral, quiet, a cafe, near the courthouse, symbolic without being obvious, and when I arrived they were already there, seated together, bodies angled inward, mirroring each other the way they always had. My mother smiled, first the practiced maternal softness. My father followed with a nod that carried authority without warmth, and before either of them spoke, I noticed how they avoided using my name, as if naming me would concede something. "We just want to talk," my mother said. And I almost laughed, because talk was never the goal, containment was. They spoke in rehearsed turns, emphasizing love, emphasizing sacrifice, emphasizing how complicated things had been back then, as if time dilutes responsibility. And at one point my father leaned forward and said something that clarified everything. He said, "Families survive by protecting themselves, not by airing dirty laundry." And there it was, the thesis statement, the moral framework they'd operated under for decades. I told them calmly that survival without truth isn't survival, it's stagnation, and that airing something requires ownership of it first. They exchanged a glance, subtle but loaded, and my mother's voice shifted sharper, less maternal, when she asked what I wanted, because this wasn't about healing anymore, it was about negotiation. I said I wanted honesty and accountability and the freedom to tell my story without interference, and my father scoffed, because scoffing is easier than apologizing. He warned me about consequences, reputational, legal, emotional consequences, as if I hadn't already paid them. And that's when I realized this meeting wasn't about reconciliation, it was about intimidation dressed as concern. I stood to leave, and my mother reached for my wrist, a familiar gesture meant to anchor me, and I gently removed her hand and said something I'd never said out loud to them before: "You don't get to touch me when you're trying to silence me." The cafe felt suddenly loud, like the world had turned the volume up on purpose, and as I walked out, I felt the weight of every boundary I'd never been allowed to set lifting at once. Later that evening, messages started arriving from relatives echoing the same script, urging forgiveness, urging discretion, urging me to think of the family name, and it became obvious my parents had activated their network, because control expands outward when it's threatened. I didn't reply to any of them because explanations invite debate, and debate was never going to be fair when one side had decades of practice. Instead, I focused on preparing for what I knew was coming next: a public reframing. It began subtly: posts about resilience, quotes about forgiveness, vague references to private pain, all designed to position my parents as dignified elders enduring an attack. And then an op-ed appeared in a local paper written by a family friend questioning the ethics of dredging up the past and warning against cancel culture targeting parents for mistakes made under different norms. And that's when anger finally burned clean, because it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about erasing harm under the guise of nostalgia. I drafted a response but didn't publish it yet because, again, timing matters. And before I continue, I want to pause right here, because this is the point in stories like this where people watching usually split into camps. Some say cut them off completely, others say hear them out, some say blood is blood. And I want to know where you're watching from right now and what your instinct is, because this isn't theoretical, it's about how power works in families everywhere.
The
escalation continued when my parents' attorney sent a cease and desist letter, not because I'd lied, but because I'd spoken, and the letter was vague, intentionally broad, citing defamation, without specifying statements, because specificity would require evidence, and evidence was not on their side. My own lawyer laughed when he read it, said this was a fishing expedition meant to scare me into silence, and that's when the shift happened inside me from reactive to strategic. I authorized my attorney to respond with documentation, timelines, affidavits, and a simple line stating that truth is an absolute defense. Within days, the cease and desist evaporated, replaced by silence, which is always the tell that a bluff has been called. But silence doesn't mean surrender, it means regrouping, and sure enough, the next move was emotional, not legal. My mother left me a voicemail crying, saying she was sick, couldn't sleep, afraid, and begging me to stop because she didn't recognize the family anymore. I listened to it once, saved it, and didn't respond because guilt only works when you accept responsibility for someone else's choices. The most disorienting part of this phase was how quickly roles reversed. The people who once held all the information were now scrambling for control, and the person once kept in the dark was suddenly illuminated and dangerous. I started receiving messages from extended relatives sharing their own suspicious stories they'd been told, inconsistencies they'd ignored because questioning elders was taboo. And each message confirmed what I already knew, that secrets don't belong to one household, they ripple outward, shaping entire systems of silence. The inquiry expanded again, this time into institutional accountability, and suddenly officials wanted to know who had facilitated the document changes, who had looked the other way, and who had benefited. And watching that unfold was surreal because the narrative shifted from family scandal to systemic failure. My parents tried one last maneuver, a public apology crafted by a consultant full of passive language and regret without admission, and it backfired spectacularly because people can smell insincerity, especially when it's polished. Comments flooded in, asking direct questions they refused to answer, and the attempt at closure reopened everything wider. I didn't respond publicly because my story didn't need a press release, it needed resolution. Privately, I began building a life not centered around reaction but intention, new routines, new relationships, new definitions of family, chosen, not inherited. Therapy helped, but so did something simpler: telling the truth out loud repeatedly until it lost its sting. There were nights I mourned the parents I never had, mornings I felt relief. I no longer had to perform loyalty to people who never offered it back, and afternoons I felt something close to gratitude that the lie hadn't followed me forever. The reckoning came quietly one afternoon when my father called from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. And he said he was sorry, not the public kind, not the defensive kind, the tired kind. And for a moment I believed him, and then he added, but you have to understand, we did what we thought was best. And that word best collapsed the apology entirely, because best for whom is the only question that matters. I told him I understood perfectly, and that understanding didn't equal acceptance, and I wished him peace because anger had done its work and no longer needed to stay. When I hung up, I realized something important: closure doesn't come from them, it comes from deciding you no longer need anything from them. The story wasn't over, but it had changed direction, no longer chasing validation, no longer defending reality, simply moving forward with clarity. And that terrified them more than anything, because control relies on engagement, and I was disengaging. The next chapter would test that resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. Because consequences don't always look like punishment, sometimes they look like absence, and the absence my parents were about to feel would force them to confront the one thing they'd spent their lives avoiding: accountability without an audience. And as much as I wanted to believe that would be the end, I knew better, because truth once spoken doesn't settle, it spreads, and the ripples from this were just beginning to reach places none of us had prepared for. The day the consequences stopped being theoretical and started walking toward me in real shoes was the day I realized revenge stories are rarely loud at the center and instead sound like 1,000 small clicks as doors close one by one. My parents learned this slowly because arrogance delays comprehension, and they'd always believed systems bent for them the way rooms did when they entered. It began with the bank calling to verify signatures that had already been verified, and the school registrar requesting supplemental documentation they'd never needed before, and a former colleague of my father's asking questions that weren't hostile but were surgical. Every inquiry alone could be dismissed as coincidence, but together they formed a pattern, and patterns are what undo people who survive on denial. I didn't orchestrate most of it, which is the part that unsettled them most, because they were used to enemies they could name and confront and intimidate. This was different. This was the residue of truth doing its work in places I couldn't reach even if I wanted to. The family network tried to regroup by shifting blame outward, suggesting I'd manipulated institutions or exaggerated facts or misunderstood history. And I watched those narratives fracture, because lies require coordination, and coordination collapses under pressure. At first they tried charm, then they tried outrage, then they tried pity. And when none of it worked, they tried silence, which they mistook for control, but was actually exposure, because silence invites others to speak. A distant cousin contacted me with documents she'd found while settling an estate, papers that contradicted the official story, and she asked if she should send them to authorities, and I told her to do what she believed was right, because I was done being the axis everything revolved around. My life had shrunk for years to accommodate their secret, and now it was expanding, and that expansion came with an unexpected grief, not for the parents I had, but for the childhood I'd reinterpreted overnight. Memories rearranged themselves like furniture moved by someone else, and I had to walk through rooms that looked familiar but felt hostile. Therapy sessions turned from shock management to identity reconstruction, because learning the truth didn't just change my past, it destabilized my sense of self. And that's the part people don't talk about when they romanticize revenge. The quiet moments where you ask who you are without the story you were handed, and whether love that was built on omission counts as love at all. My parents attempted one final grand gesture, a mediated apology session proposed through a mutual acquaintance framed as restorative justice, and I declined because restoration requires consent from the harmed, and I wasn't ready to lend mine. Instead, I focused on grounding myself, building routines that weren't reactions, and relationships that didn't require explanation. Still, the world kept intruding, because scandals ripple outward, and institutions hate uncertainty. An ethics committee opened a review, and suddenly my parents' past decisions were being reevaluated through a lens they'd never anticipated, and that review didn't need my testimony, because documentation speaks fluently when people lie inconsistently. At the midpoint of all this, I want to pause again, because if you're still listening, you're probably asking yourself what you'd do in this situation, whether you'd burn everything down or disappear, or try to save what could be saved. And I want to know where you're watching from right now, and what time it is there, because these stories travel differently depending on where you're standing in the world, and the advice we give is always shaped by our own proximity to power. The personal fallout intensified when my parents' social circle began to thin, not dramatically, but decisively. Invitations slowed, conversations shortened, eye contact lingered just long enough to register discomfort, and I recognized the look, because I'd worn it myself when I suspected something was wrong but didn't know what. My mother reached out again, this time without intermediaries, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, asking if there was any way to make this stop, and I told her the truth, that it had already stopped the moment the truth surfaced, because consequences aren't something you negotiate, they're something you live through. She cried, and I didn't feel satisfaction or cruelty. I felt distance, like watching a storm move across water, knowing it will pass. Without you, The legal ramifications advanced methodically, assets frozen, pending review, names removed from boards, quietly websites updated without ceremony, and each change chipped away at the image my parents had curated for decades. They tried to portray themselves as victims of a cruel modern lens, but victimhood without innocence doesn't persuade for long, and eventually even their defenders grew tired of explaining inconsistencies. I started receiving messages from strangers, people who'd been adopted or misled or raised inside secrets, telling me my story gave them language, and that was the first time I felt something like purpose emerge from the wreckage. Not triumph, not revenge, but usefulness. My parents attempted to reassert control by threatening estrangement, as if it hadn't already occurred, and I realized then how deeply they misunderstood the situation, because estrangement was their punishment, not mine. The reckoning reached a peak during a community forum, when a moderator asked a simple question about transparency, and my father froze because there was no answer that didn't implicate him, and that moment was broadcast, not virally, not sensationally, just archived permanently, which is often worse. Afterward, he called me and accused me of orchestrating the humiliation, and I said something that surprised us both. I said, "You taught me how systems work, you just didn't think I'd ever be on the other side of one." The silence that followed was heavy and final. I thought that would be the end, but stories like this don't end cleanly, they taper and echo. Months later, a journalist reached out with a draft asking for comment, and I declined again because my life was no longer an appendix to theirs. Instead, I wrote a private letter to my younger self, the one who sensed something wrong but lacked evidence, and I told them they weren't crazy, they were perceptive, and that letter did more to settle me than any confrontation ever could. The fallout left my parents isolated in ways money and reputation couldn't fix, because isolation is the tax on secrecy, and they'd accrued interest for decades. I built a chosen family slowly, deliberately, people who knew the truth and didn't require me to defend it, and the relief of that honesty was profound. Still, there were nights when anger returned sharp and unexpected, and I learned to let it pass without feeding it, because anger had served its purpose and now clarity was the work. The final shift came when I realized I no longer rehearsed arguments in my head, no longer anticipated their reactions, no longer checked for their approval, and that freedom was quiet, almost boring, but deeply stable. The story wasn't finished, because identities don't reassemble overnight, and consequences continue to unfold, but the direction was set, and it pointed away from them and toward a life that didn't require secrecy to function. The next phase would test whether distance could coexist with accountability, and whether healing requires reconciliation or simply recognition, and that question was about to surface in a way I hadn't predicted, because the past has a habit of resurfacing when you least expect it, and the truth, once loose, doesn't just change one family, it challenges every assumption that protected it, which meant the reckoning was far from over, and the next revelation would force all of us to decide what we were willing to lose to keep living honestly. By the time the seventh movement of this whole mess began, I had stopped marking days by calendars and started marking them by sensations, the tightness behind my eyes when another email arrived, the dull hum in my chest when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, the strange calm that followed each small collapse of the old narrative, because calm after chaos feels suspicious until you realize it's just clarity finally catching up. The next escalation didn't come from courts or committees, it came from blood, the kind people swear is thicker than truth until truth proves otherwise. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years reached out late one night, not to apologize, not to defend, but to ask a question that felt like a confession wrapped in curiosity. She asked if I remembered a summer when I was 8, when I was sent away to a camp I didn't want to attend, and my parents said it was for enrichment and growth and character building, and I remembered it vividly, the smell of chlorine, the scratchy bunk bed, the way I cried into a pillow for 2 nights straight before learning how to go quiet. She told me that camp had been chosen specifically because it was far away from anyone who might ask questions. At a time when questions were dangerous, and suddenly a memory I'd filed under inconvenience reclassified itself as strategy, and that's when it hit me that the betrayal wasn't a single act, it was an architecture. They hadn't just hidden the truth, they designed my childhood around its concealment, adjusting routes, schedules, friendships, even photos to minimize risk and maximize control. When I confronted my parents with this new understanding, there was no explosion, there was something worse there. was relief because secrets age people, and they were tired of carrying it, and tired people tell the truth sloppily. My mother admitted they'd always planned to tell me someday, but someday kept moving because the cost of honesty kept rising, and every year they delayed it became easier to justify another delay. And I asked her a question I'd been saving. Do you know what it does to a person to realize their entire origin story was curated without their consent? And she couldn't answer, because there is no answer that repairs that fracture. The consequences intensified as more relatives began to talk not out of courage, but out of self-preservation, because once one's secret breaks, others fear exposure, and they rush to control the narrative. I learned about documents amended quietly, about guardianship contingencies discussed in hushed tones, about a plan that existed in case I ever found out the wrong way. And that phrase lodged itself in my brain like a shard, because there is no right way to discover your parents were siblings, and everyone knew, and decided silence was kinder than truth. The social fallout reached a strange tipping point where people who'd avoided me now sought proximity as if truth were contagious, and they wanted immunity by association. And I had to learn a new skill, which was discernment. Not everyone who shows up late deserves a seat at the table. Halfway through all of this, I need to pause, because if you're still here listening to this unravel, you're probably reacting viscerally, and I want you to drop where you're watching from right now and what time it is there, because stories like this hit differently depending on your distance from family expectations and cultural silence, and I want to hear how this lands where you are. The legal dimension shifted again when an archival record surfaced contradicting sworn statements, and that record didn't accuse, it simply existed, and existence is devastating to lies because it requires no interpretation. My parents' remaining allies began to peel away, citing optics and fatigue, and I watched as a fortress built on omission crumbled, not from attack, but from exposure to daylight. The reckoning became internal then, because external punishment can distract from the deeper work, which is mourning the parents you thought you had, and accepting the ones you actually did. Therapy sessions turned toward anger, not as a problem to be solved, but as information to be listened to, and my anger told me I deserved authorship over my own life narrative, and that withholding truth is a form of control no matter how lovingly it's framed. My parents attempted one final reframing, positioning themselves as products of a different time, different values, different pressures, and I acknowledged the context without absolving the choice, because understanding is not the same as excusing, and they struggled with that distinction. The most unsettling moment came when my father asked if any of this would have mattered if I'd never found out. And I said yes, because lies don't need discovery to cause harm. They shape behavior, relationships, self-worth, even in silence. And that silence had shaped me into someone hypervigilant, intuitive, and self-doubting all at once. The public narrative quieted as scandals do, replaced by newer outrages, but the private consequences deepened, because when attention fades, accountability must stand on its own. And my parents found that without an audience, their justification sounded hollow. Even to themselves, I built rituals to replace the ones that had been tainted, celebrating chosen milestones with people who knew the whole story and didn't flinch. And that normalcy was radical because it wasn't performative. Messages continued to arrive from viewers and readers who saw themselves in the story, not because of the incest detail, but because of the betrayal, the gaslighting, the lifelong sense that something was off, and being told to stop being dramatic. And I realized the specificity of my story was a doorway, not a destination. My parents asked again for reconciliation, framed this time as mutual healing, and I told them healing doesn't require proximity, it requires honesty and accountability, and sometimes distance is the most honest boundary available. The turning point of this section came unexpectedly when I was invited to speak at a closed forum about transparency and ethics, and I almost declined because I was tired of being the example, but I went, and when I spoke, I didn't mention my parents. I talked about systems that incentivize silence and how families mirror institutions when power goes unchecked. And afterward, a woman approached me and said, "I wish someone had spoken like that when I was a kid." And I felt a click inside me, the sound of purpose settling. My parents' world continued to shrink, not because I pushed, but because truth does that. It redraws maps and exposes dead ends. And the final exchange of this chapter was brief, a message from my mother, acknowledging for the first time without qualifiers that what they did was wrong, not complicated, not understandable, just wrong. And that sentence didn't fix anything, but it landed like a full stop instead of an excuse. I didn't respond immediately because I didn't need to, and that was the real shift. The urgency had left my body, replaced by agency. The story wasn't over because stories like this don't end neatly, they evolve, but the next phase would ask a harder question, not what do they deserve, but what do I want to build with the life that remains? And that question would lead to a revelation that reframed everything, not about them, but about me, and what happens when the truth stops being a weapon and starts being a foundation. And that turn was coming whether anyone was ready or not. What changed in the final stretch wasn't a courtroom ruling or a family apology or even a public reckoning. It was the quiet moment when I realized the story had stopped chasing me, and I was now walking ahead of it, carrying the truth like a tool instead of a wound. Because up until then, everything had been reactive, every conversation, every boundary, every decision framed around what they did, what they hid, what they owed. And suddenly that gravity loosened, and I could feel space opening where my future could actually breathe. The last confrontation wasn't dramatic. It happened in a kitchen that smelled like oversteeped tea, and old wood where my parents sat across from me, not as villains, not as monsters, but as people who had built an entire life on a lie and were finally standing in the aftermath of its collapse. And there was nothing left to argue because arguments require two versions of reality, and we were finally standing in the same one. They asked what I wanted, and that question landed heavy because it was the first time they had ever asked without conditions, without steering, without an agenda. And I told them the truth, that I wanted distance, not punishment, that I wanted accountability, not performance, that I wanted the freedom to define myself without their fear shaping the edges. My mother cried quietly, my father stared at his hands, and for a moment I felt the old reflex to comfort, to minimize, to say it's okay, even when it wasn't. And that reflex dying was its own kind of grief because it meant I was no longer the child tasked with stabilizing adults. The consequences continued to ripple outward in ways I couldn't predict: friendships, rearranged alliances, dissolved stories rewritten behind closed doors. But none of it pulled me back because I had crossed a threshold where truth became non-negotiable, and that made everything else optional. I moved cities not to escape, but to choose. I packed boxes, slowly touching objects that belonged to a version of me that survived without knowing, and thanking her for getting me here before letting her rest. In the new place, anonymity felt luxurious. Nobody knew my family history, nobody whispered, nobody watched for cracks. And that normalcy taught me something important, which is that identity built on secrecy is fragile, but identity built on choice is resilient. Halfway through this reflection, I want to pause and ask you directly, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Because stories like this stretch across cultures and families, and I want to know how far this one has traveled to reach you, and whether it's night or morning where you are, because that changes how truth hits. The midsection of healing wasn't peaceful, it was disorienting, because when chaos leaves, silence can feel like abandonment, and I had to learn that quiet doesn't mean danger, sometimes it means safety. Finally arrived, I started telling the story differently, not leading with shock, not explaining myself, but stating facts calmly and watching how people responded. And that became a filter, because anyone who tried to sensationalize it didn't get access, and anyone who listened without flinching earned trust. My parents attempted one last repair gesture, inviting me to a mediated conversation framed as closure, and I declined, not out of anger, but clarity, because closure isn't something others give you. It's something you stop needing from them. The final legal loose ends resolved, quietly documents, corrected records, amended the past, acknowledged, without ceremony, and that lack of drama felt like victory, because the most powerful reckoning doesn't need witnesses. What surprised me most was how many people reached out privately after hearing the story, not because of a headline, but because they too sensed something off in their family's secrets, half-truths, gaps in timelines, and they were afraid to look. And I told them something I wish I'd heard sooner, which is that truth doesn't destroy families, lies do. Truth only reveals what was already broken. The last phase of this journey wasn't about revenge, it was about authorship. I began writing not to expose, but to understand, mapping how systems of silence operate, how loyalty gets weaponized, how children are taught to protect adults at the cost of themselves, and that work turned pain into purpose, without romanticizing it. My relationship with my parents settled into something honest and limited. There were no holidays together, no performative reconciliations, just occasional updates, and a mutual understanding that some bridges once burned are better left as boundaries. The biggest shift came when I stopped asking what they owed me and started asking what I owed myself. And the answer was a life built on transparency, relationships that don't require me to shrink, and a future that doesn't orbit around the past. I still get asked whether I wish I'd never found out, and my answer remains the same. Knowing was painful, but not knowing was corrosive, and I would choose the pain of truth over the poison of silence every time. As this chapter closes, the intrigue doesn't disappear, it transforms, because the next question isn't about them anymore. It's about what happens when someone raised inside a lie builds something real, and what that kind of honesty can heal beyond a single family. If you've stayed with me this far, I want you to do too. Things first, tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were in my position, and whether you think family loyalty has limits. And second, don't let this be the last story you hear, because the next one goes even deeper into what happens after the truth settles, when the dust clears, and you have to decide who you become without the weight of other people's secrets shaping your spine. This story doesn't end here, it evolves, and the next chapter is about rebuilding identity after betrayal. And why sometimes the most radical revenge is living openly without fear. And if you think this one hit hard, the next one will hit closer, because it's not about discovery, it's about transformation, and you won't want to miss that.